Hello, yeah, I've just been putting through to you. My name's Neil Gray. I was hoping that I could arrange an interview with somebody from Four Ports about the development. I mean, probably most specifically stuff that comes out the Leaf Docks development framework.
What I'll do is I'll pass on the message and I'll ask someone to give you a call back tomorrow.
Hello Neil, it's Bill Shaw here.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
So what's the film that you're making?
The film is basically a broad look at regeneration along Leaf and Granton.
Right, so it's all focused on regeneration, the changes in the area. I guess within the interview with Nathan, you just really want to get an update on what they're doing, what the strategy is, what the vision is for the area. Because it used to be, if you wind the clock back sort of 15 years ago, even when all that land was pretty much, a lot of it was industrial use, and it was owned by the port operator, Fourth Port Authority at the time. Then it went privatized, became Fourth Port PLC. And they had a look at the property and thought, well, you know, a lot of this is derelict land, brownfield site, and the rest of it's being used for industrial purposes. Not the best place to be for some industrial operators. And also, the land is worth a lot of money now because Edinburgh house prices are going through the roof. Demographics are changing. There's a much bigger demand now for smaller properties, but more of them.
Scale of the development is 345 acres, which is the whole site, and that includes the harbour, which is about 80 acres, which is owned by Fourth Ports and developed by Fourth Property Holdings, and then the old gas works site. So we've got three developers. Waterfront Edinburgh has all of the water area, 1.3 kilometres along here, connecting up to the harbour wall. The major thing that we're trying to do is to ensure for the social inclusion issues is that West Granton Road is not seen both as a physical and mental barrier. What we don't want is a feeling of the new community being them and us.
Pennywell is the area that's on the corner between Muirhouse and Pilton. What they have been finding is that the 300 houses that were proposed for demolition, the people that were the occupants in there have been finding a real struggle to find anywhere else decent to live. Out of 300 occupants on that land, do you know how many people have actually got a place down on the waterfront? And that's not even guaranteed. It's only provisional. 1. The distance between the community and people like developers and planners and policymakers, the gap between them is growing wider. And people are getting more and more alienated from that. And yet the Scottish Executive seem to be coming out with more and more proposals, allegedly, to bring people on side. I think it's part of a process to keep us tied up in committee meetings, offering up experiences, opinions, criticisms, whatever, whilst at the same time they can go outside of the meeting, completely ignore what we've said, which is what is happening in reality, and make their own decisions. But they can tick that little box that says, have you consulted the community?
How it came to be developed was that the city saw this not largely derelict, but certainly contaminated and brownfield land out here. And obviously it's a huge resource at 345 acres in the context of the whole city. And this was identified back in the 80s. And they went through a process of looking at what they could do with it, master planning it.
One of the real mistakes, I think, down here, if we call it mistake, is that there's never been what would probably be called a master plan. Everybody and his brother comes forward with a plan for a bit of land and calls it a master plan. These are not master plans, they're development plans. They try to get as much on a particular piece of land as possible, and then with no concern for the piece of land next to it or the piece of land on that side. So gradually they join up, but they don't relate to each other. Now, what's always been really essential, and in any European country, serious European country we would have done it, would be to do a planning diagram from here down to Portobello and say, okay, what do we need here? Where do we need houses? Where do we need schools? Where do we need workplaces? Where do we need, all the component parts of essentially a new town?
What has happened over the past 10, 15 years normally is the creation of something called urban regeneration companies. And those companies are merely facilitators. And what they try and do is leverage in public sector money and then gradually bring in private sector money after all of the public sector has delivered the land. Well, that wasn't the case with Waterfront Edinburgh, because roughly 33 million went in, of which cash came in, a lot of cash came in, half of that came in from Scottish Enterprise, and the city put land and cash in. What that allowed us to do...
The 1980s saw a government coming into power that talked, certainly from 1982, about intervening in the cities and addressing what it described as urban blight, which had itself arisen from a process of deindustrialization that had occurred over the previous 10, 15, 20 years. It put forward proposals for transforming particularly the dockland areas, and one of the first acts of that new Tory government was, of course, to privatise the docks. They were one of the first privatisation that took place. Linked to the development of an ideology, a call for redevelopment and regeneration, was the assumption that the main motive force for change would be property development. In Scotland, we saw the development of the Clyde Port Authority as a major property owner and the Forth Ports as property owners. And if you look at the shareholders within those companies at that stage, the Scottish merchant banks and investment trusts were very much to the fore.
The decline of the manufacturing sector was purely as a result of the government's policies in the late 70s, 80s through to the 90s. There was an absolute determination, especially by the Thatcherite government, to move us out of being a primary producer. In the shipbuilding and dock working and things like that, that was destroyed as a result of the privatisation of the dock labour scheme. They were directly as a consequence of government policies that these things happened. They'd got over the war in the 1940s, 1950s. They'd put plant and machinery in, but they hadn't modernised that plant and machinery in the 70s and 80s. And so they couldn't cope with continental competition. They couldn't cope with competition from the Far East, from America and places like that. And so British industry, slowly and surely, was killed off directly because of government policies.
That is all Forth Port's own land. And over time what they've done is they've changed it from being there for industrial use because of the property values in it, where the demand for housing. All that land has been really utilised for that type of use. Because obviously the benefit has been the regeneration of the area. It's gone from an industrial area to a residential and more contemporary commercial use. If you like, more white collar than blue collar use. Now, long-term strategy is the port will be pretty much wound down. There will still be some industrial aspects to the port, but most of the port operators, and they're quite happy to do this, will be looking to move to places like Rosyth or Grangemouth. It reflects the change to the general economy as well, that there's an opportunity to create commercial centres in these areas, for more office type jobs, sort of higher value jobs, if you like, and also residential areas too.
There's two worlds in this city. There's the world of those who have it, and there's a world of those who haven't. And the world of those who haven't is a very disadvantaged world in many, many ways, and it's made more acute by the fact that it is set so closely cheek by jowl with this world of those who have. The people who can afford to go to Harvey Nicks, and the people who can afford to eat in good restaurants and can afford to go and drink coffee and go to happy hour and goodness knows what else. And that actually makes it look and feel even worse.
The objective for Scotland is to double its tourism income. And obviously, because of the success of the city of Edinburgh of actually bringing people in, what we want to do is improve the number of people coming in. And there's been a recent study showing that we need somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 new hotel rooms by 2015. There aren't many places you can put those within the city centre.
The impact of tourism generally tends to pass communities like this completely by. We're not involved in it. We might end up selling hot dogs or cleaning up and working in the cafes and all the other kind of activities that are generated by tourism. They will pump millions easily into attracting businesses to locate. The inducements are there, the encouragements are there, the rent rebates, the rate rebates, whatever, are all provided. It's all there, it's a package. The problem being, there is only a finite amount of money within the council's budget. So if that money is used for that kind of activity, money must be taken away from somewhere else. I want to move away from tartan and shortbread, but they don't actually want people to see real people's lives. And it's that kind of thing, it's that desire to present an image to people and not really address the reality of what the city is like that you live in, that I think is quite worrying. But it also means that communities like this don't access any of the rewards that come from tourism.
At a local level, obviously, it's reuse of a facility in terms of the land. After all, we don't make any more land, and so it's a diminishing resource generally. So it's very important to end up with 345 acres that can be reused. You've then got to look at the benefits of the economy. As we were saying, the amount of public sector investment will leverage in a huge amount of private sector. End values out here are in the billions.
I think this is one small part of a kind of 20-kilometre landscape that is being put together bit by bit, with each bit being considered individually rather than collectively. And I think that's one of the challenges that really isn't being discussed at the moment.
There's always this argument of what form of architecture do you have? You know, do you try and recreate the architecture that Edinburgh is famous for, or do you go for very, very modernistic architecture? It then comes down to what can you deliver economically.
The standard of construction has been put up fast, steel frames, render on the outside, not necessarily the kind of materials that work well on a north-facing river edge with the kind of climate we have here in Edinburgh. I think some of these buildings are going to look pretty shabby fairly soon. One of the problems with that is that the people who own them, it doesn't bother them because they're not going to be paying the maintenance, because a lot of these have been bought as buy-to-let properties, as a portfolio, they're sold on, they're rented out, the people living in them are only living for a certain length of time, they'll move on. The care and concern that's needed to build a community isn't necessarily founded in this kind of construction and this kind of architecture.
You cannot have any regeneration area that would ever work unless it is done for the benefit of the local community and in consultation with that local community.
The Waterfront Development Company started out having consultation meetings in the 5 areas of Greater Pilton. And eventually we went along to them and we'd put comments in and we'd ask them questions and we'd get some information back. But eventually they became information meetings, purely information meetings. We are giving you this information about the waterfront. They don't care. They actually do not care. Consultants come in and make statements about how we can regenerate this area, you know, and Scottish executives forever banging the drum about regeneration. They haven't got a clue. There are people making millions out of regeneration.
So the developers very much try to ensure that the development proposals that we are doing are shared with the community, that those views expressed by the community are then taken and incorporated, because quite often what has happened in the past is the views were put forward and it was almost a bit of a talking shop. People didn't take notice. Well, we do.
The whole way that things are handled is to exclude the community, to not listen to the community. Or if the community is listened to, it's a token hearing that we get. We don't feel that the waterfront is part of our community. We do feel that that road divides the communities as well. It's the kind of arrogance, the kind of refusal to listen, the kind of belief that as councillors and managers, they know best. The fact that people who've lived in the area for decades have absolutely nothing to contribute to the debate. I think it is contempt that the community has been treated with, and I think it will run and run and run.
It's not just about money, it's not just about who owns the sites, it's about engaging these people in a better discussion about the quality of the environment. This is the last major edge of the city to be developed, and we're going to give it away for the next 50 years if we don't think a bit harder about it now. The gap sites like this, the things that are still to be built on, these are still our opportunities. These are the things that are still going through planning, the things that are still to be discussed about whether we want housing. How many 1 and 2 bedroom flats can we can Edinburgh absorb? We need actually family housing, we need places for people to go to school, we need the places for them to go to work, we need places for kindergartens, you name it. These things aren't paid for by the private sector. That's one of the problems, that what the private sector is putting out is filling every site right to its edges with as many units of accommodation as they can get on it.